Go ahead.
Well, you talk. I'm looking at the questions.
Okay, well, welcome once again, and we're glad you joined us, and the others will join us along the way, and you might connect with us by way of live streaming. So we got a bunch of questions, some of them from previous weeks, some of them that have come in during the course of this week, and so we're ready to take them on, I guess.
Oh, we are?
Yeah.
I will let you.
Yes, you were going to say something about general guidelines or anything like that.
Not today.
Oh, okay.
But okay. I mean, I do have some here in case things get. But look at the pages of papers we have here. So trees died, so that we have pages of papers. I'm putting Rebecca's question over here for now.
Okay.
We can bring it back because outside of her we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.5 questions we could work on. And yes, if you send us a question during the week, which we encourage you to do, and by the way, I was going to say, we will discuss a few topics tonight. We've discussed some in the past. If you have a follow-up question about something that we've said, please feel free to email it to us, and we can entertain follow-ups to original questions that occur to you or that someone might, you know how people, I don't know how you're actually talking with people nowadays, but people sometimes will spring questions on you because you're the most religious person they know, and you probably have an answer, and you'll be going blah, 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 blah. Or you'll just start talking and see if something intelligent comes out. Sometimes people handle it that way. Or sometimes people just go, or I'll have to look in the Bible and get back to you sometimes as an answer. And so that happens to us too. So feel free to, bounce back a question that's been covered and see if there's something else that occurred to you or somebody else you wouldn't know, right?
Exactly.
All right. We have the topics tonight are way across the board. I'm not sure which one. Oh my gosh, John had to do actual research.
I was just I always make notes.
I know, but I'm saying, I'm just telling them. Yeah. I'm not criticizing you.
I know you're not.
Oh, okay. He did actual research, and we had a very, very good discussion about a couple of these. Yes, but I think that's too heavy to start with now.
Yeah, it probably.
What shall we talk about in general?
Well, we could simply do them in the order in which they came in.
I don't know what order that is. Would you like to put them in order, Mr. Bookkeeper?
Here we go.
Well, I've got one here from that. I have a 29th.
Yeah.
I have August 29th. I have June 27th. Only because we didn't discuss this part, which I think we should.
Yes, okay.
So that'd be it. August 8th. We covered that last week. I think you have the earliest one, sir, if you're looking for that. This is about the types of heart.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm. Oh, wait, and the fourth's not here. Okay.
Yeah.
All right, so that one's done.
Okay, whatever you say. So, but still don't do that one.
No.
All right. Shall I do this one and give it it's not going to be the total answer, but it's as much of an answer as we're going to give.
You could if you want to start there.
No, not really. Excuse us while we find one that's suitable to start with. You have
Yes.
This is a general one.
Yeah.
Okay, first of all, let me say this is not for tonight. So that might mean a whole group of people just turn off their computers. We got a very good question, a question worth discussing. And I'll read it to you. But
it was the last one that came in.
It was the last one that came in. So I'm going to explain to you that it's going to take more time to discuss it than we probably have tonight because we have several other things that are very important too. But here's the question, so everybody can be thinking about it. When we speak of God, as in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, are we referring to the same God as in other cultures? if one speaks of Allah, is that the same God? I'm taking that to mean as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I'm going to give you a traditional Jewish preliminary answer, yes and no, or no and yes. However, I don't think we're going to get a chance to discuss this, but I have been thinking about it quite a bit. And we have chatted about it a little bit. We've chatted about other questions this week more. So thank you for sending in questions. It gives John and I something to chat about. Well, you know, we live here in the same house, other than the baseball season. So it's actually very, very good for us, right?
Yeah.
Okay. You know, I've always heard that saying, the family that prays together stays together. I would have to amend that to say, the family that roots for the same sports teams stays together. Correct?
Something like that.
Yeah. Okay, so probably not going to cover. Is God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the same God when other people in other nationalities, other countries, other cultures talk about God? Yes and no. So, all right, so then I'm putting that on our slightly postponed pile. Now what are we going to start with? I would say this one.
You want to start with that one?
Yes, because we're not going to give an extensive answer.
All right.
All right. So here is another question sent in by one of our viewers. Somebody says, why the Jewish dietary laws seem to be very strictly followed, I guess within Judaism, while the vast majority of other laws are not. I guess that would be from someone who doesn't know a lot of people who, Jewish people keep the laws. Why are you pointing something out to me?
You know who it's from.
I know, that's not my point.
Okay, sorry.
My point is I'm trying to generalize.
Okay, gotcha.
Which seems to be saying, have I noticed that especially Messianic Jews are very, very hyper about food laws and not so much about the other laws? Yes, I have. I've noticed that about many Messianic Jews. Boy, I don't know if you've known anyone like this, but we sure have, where they're almost like a newly converted person in the sense that they've gone native. And once they've made a commitment to say, I'm not going to eat anything God doesn't want me to eat by reading the Bible, then they are insufferable. And they read every food label while you're standing next to them. They read them out loud. Then they go into, I can't eat that in a very loud voice. Haven't they heard about this in a very loud voice? Really, I found it's terrible to eat this in a very loud voice when you're just trying to enjoy your lovely snack after Shabbat. Don't know if you've known any people like that, but I should have. And I don't care for that. I don't care for that kind of person when I'm trying to enjoy a lovely group meal. I know we've forgotten what it's like to have a lovely group refreshment time. Where we're, hi, how are you? How was your week? How's your, fill in the blank? How's that going for you? And then you hear a person in a loud voice pointing to a box of something saying, well, look at that. I dislike that very much. And I do not think that that's what God wants us to do. But anyway, you give your opinion here.
Well, I think now to move it a little more broadly within the general world of Judaism.
Yes.
First of all, there are those who observe the food laws strictly, and there are those who observe the food laws not quite so strictly. By and large, in the larger Jewish world, those who strictly observe the food laws also very strictly observe the rest of what Judaism is about. Too frequently, we refer to them as laws. They are actually, because people misunderstand the term Torah to indicate law. So let's take one step back there and remind ourselves that the word Torah does not mean law. In the Hebrew, it means instruction. So these are the instructions and the guidelines from God. And those who follow strictly the food guidelines, also in the larger world of Judaism, strictly follow the other guidelines that are part of Jewish life. I think sometimes it may appear that this is the focus because certain things within Judaism are far more easily observed visibly, whereas others, you don't get to see them quite so frequently or commonly. For example, you wouldn't know how a person lives in their home. You wouldn't necessarily know unless you're with them whether they observe Shabbat. But generally speaking, in the larger Jewish world, some of the key identifying markers in the larger Jewish community related to Jewish observance tend to be observance of Shabbat and observance of the food guidelines. Of course, there's also...
You can see those.
Yes, you can
Those
see.
are outward forms of behavior that people can see.
But sometimes you don't even see them, you don't necessarily know whether they're observing Shabbat or not. So these are just some of the more visible ones. Certainly within the traditional Jewish community, the observant Jewish community, sometimes you'll recognize the very, very, very observant by the way in which they dress. Sometimes you will have
clothing style. Clothing style.
Sometimes it's very observant or strictly observant Jews. You may not know how observant they are by the way in which they dress. So we need to be careful not to assume that the focus is only on what we can observe if that's what's being strictly observed. Is that fair enough? All right. Given that, let me just take an aside because this is an important aside, and this aside is important because there's a misunderstanding not only in some areas of the Christian community, but in some areas of the Messianic Jewish community as well. And that is that these guidelines that God gave to us concerning what we eat were set aside when Yeshua came. And therefore, we don't need to be worried about them. Within my own family, which is a family of Yeshua-believing Jews, I would say we're the only ones.
Us and our children, you mean?
Us and our children are the only ones who follow the food guidelines, because in the other parts of my family, they have, how should I put it, incorporated a traditional Christian understanding with respect to whether the food guidelines are relevant to today or not. So let me address that because I think that's important to address. Usually the understanding that the guidelines, the food guidelines have been set aside come from one and or two passages. So I'm going to review those for you. We've talked about them in the past in various things. The first one is found in Mark chapter 17, or Mark chapter 7, verses 18 and 19. And were you going to say something? Okay. And the statement is, it's not what goes into a person that causes them to be unclean, for lack of a better term. Well, causes them to be, the term is unclean.
I'm just going to...
Yeah. Anyhow, so it's not what goes into a person that causes a person to be unclean, but what comes out of that person that causes them to be unclean. And we may want to further define the term unclean. And then in most translations of Mark, you'll find this in parentheses. He said this so as to declare all foods clean. So let's deal with that first of all. If you go back to the very beginning of Mark chapter 7, and you need to have context, the discussion throughout all of Mark 7 is the whole concept of hand washing. When do you wash hands? When do you wash the vessels that you are using, utensils you are using for food? And there was a back and forth in those days concerning that. And in his specific statements through this back and forth discussion in Mark chapter 7, Yeshua, in fact, uses phrasing that is part of the ongoing current discussion of his time. So you know he's entering that discussion. Cleaning of hands, cleaning of food, vessels for food use. And then comes this statement. And if you think about this statement in that context, you can understand then why he says that. It's not what goes into a person. In other words, whether you've had your hands washed or whether you don't wash the vessels properly that causes the person to be unclean. It's what comes out of that person. If you look in that context, food is never mentioned once in that context in Mark chapter 7.
In fact, I've been just quickly reading the first, it's really, the story we're talking about is in the first 23 verses of Mark 7. In my particular Bible, I have here the label for the subsection is clean and unclean. And so I highly recommend reading this, because as you're reading what Yeshua talks about in this, we have these same issues. Let me just read the issues that are here. Mark 7:1 says, the Pharisees and some of the teachers of the law who had come from Jerusalem gathered around Yeshua and saw some of his disciples eating food with hands that were, quote, unclean. And that, quote, unclean is in my version. That is unwashed. So they were eating food with unwashed hands. And what have we heard about for the past? It's more than 6 months, 8 months. You're out in public, you're going to eat some food. Do you want to eat that food with hands that are unwashed? And what would the CDC say to us all? No, no, no. Did you do your hand washing, 20-second hand washing? It really is more about that situation that we know about every day anymore. It says, the Pharisees and all the Jews who do not eat, and all the Jews do not eat unless they give their hands a ceremonial washing, holding to the tradition of the elders. I want to point out that even the rudimentary health considerations that we are doing now in America at this day and age, this washing of hands before you eat is really stems back to these ideas that, hey, people in general, you should wash your hands before you eat. They didn't have that problem in so many other cultures of the world. They didn't care when and if they washed their hands at all, much less before eating, after doing other things. Just think about it for a minute and then stop thinking about it because it's icky. That would not be a consideration. Notice here, it's the topic. Is it a good idea to eat or do these other things? And not only your hands, but the utensils that you put food into. Oh, my bowl, I'm so proud of my bowl because it's been unwashed for generations and it's really authentic and pristine. And are you going to have a lovely meal out of that bowl? What do we say? No, no, no. What would they say? Sure, go right ahead. Unclean, who cares? Cleanliness is in the eyes of the eater.
In the mouth of the eater?
Yeah, in the mouth of the eater. But that's what the context of this is about. But, human beings nowadays are really bad. And we take the Bible and just pick out 3 or 4 verses and I love those verses. I'm taking those. The rest, nah. Anyway, I'm yapping, so go ahead.
No, that's fine. No, because that's relevant. That's the relevant context to this discussion. Now, so what about that phrase in parentheses? By saying this, he declared all foods clean. Well, not to get too technical, because this has to do with grammatical construction. That is not the best, if not, let me change that. That is not a very good translation of what is there in that grammatical construction. You have a participle that's being connected to something else there. And if you look at the King James Version, and we are no big fans of the King James, but if you look at the King James Version, then what you find in this part of the translation is a very good translation. The statement of explanation there is because food goes into the, let's say, the digestive system, and then is passed out, Old English, into the draught, D-R-O-G-H. In other words,
The drought. They sometimes draft, sometimes drought,
drought,
but not drought in a sense of no rain.
no.
Right.
In other words, it gets passed, let's be quite specific here, and the text is specific, and the biblical text can often be quite graphic. It gets passed on into the sewer system. So the image that you see that's used in Mark is food goes into the mouth, into the stomach, and then it is eliminated. And in fact, the term cleanse that is used there is a term that is in that larger context, often used for stuff that's been expelled from the body. All right. So that's the context. If we want to rephrase it, for what goes in must come out. That's what he's talking about. And that's further reinforced when you look at the exact parallel passage in Matthew as compared to Mark. And it sounds exactly the same way until you get to verse 20. What precedes it is what comes out of the mouth is what defiles a person. And then it talks about some of the things that come out of a person's mouth. It says then, these are what defile a person, but to eat with unwashed hands does not defile a person. That's the concluding statement in Matthew chapter 15. If you understand Mark chapter 7, 18 and 19 correctly, Mark is saying exactly the same thing, except he adds this, for lack of a better way to put it, keep little statement. What goes in must come out. All right, fair enough? That's the Mark text and the related Matthew text. And too often, it's only the Mark text that's focused on and not the Matthew text, because the Matthew text is quite straightforward. It doesn't deal with anything that would cause someone even possibly or remotely to translate it, so declared all things clear. Fair enough?
Plus, I always like to give the initial. I don't talk very much during the word food.
Yes, thank you.
If I was pointing to various things on my house and asked you a question, is this food? Is this cup food? Is this pen food? Is this ginger ale? Not the bottle, but is the ginger ale food? Then some of you would make funny jokes about people who drink carbonated beverages here in America, and that's all right. But in general, the term food is dependent on what culture you live in and what culture you follow. So what you consider food may not be food to other people in your culture. I'll give you examples. Various animals. Is a snake food? In other words, yum, let's kill a snake and eat it because it's delicious? Not in this culture. Do John and I know people who actually have eaten a snake and they said it wasn't bad, but that was because they were forced to by the special services of the army that they were in at the time? Yeah, and we were all horrified, but we went, okay, you were in that job, but I'm not going in that job. So is this, hold up this, food? Is blood sausage food? Well, it is in some areas of the world, and we've been to those areas. And John and I say, no, thank you. That's what we say. No, thank you. Why? Because it's not food for us. We don't want to eat it. And they go, oh, vegetarians? And we go, something like that. Yes. Right? Something like that. That's the easiest way to define it for you people.
And given, are you done?
Well, I was just going to say. So when we say is pig meat food? Well, many people around us in America and many cultures say yes, yummy, 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 yummy. And we are among those who say no, thank you. No, thank you. So we can have cultural recognition of certain things that are food in our eyes, but in other cultures of the world, they would never eat that thing that you're eating. They would never, for various reasons. And the Bible gives you one recommended set of standards. It depends on how much you want to fit in with the standards of the scripture. I'm not saying, can eating non-kosher things send you to hell? By no means. However, someone has made a joke. Oh, Rabbi, if I eat non-kosher meat, will I go to hell? And the rabbi said, oh, well, I don't think so. But then again, you might get there sooner if you continue to eat that. That was a joke. I was not trying to nag anybody about anything. Anyway, go ahead here.
Okay, this discussion that Patrice brought us into is important too for the context, both of Mark 7 and Matthew 15. And that is when Yeshua referred to food, to what was he referring? And again, let me remind you, food is not the subject anywhere.
It's being unwashed. It's being unwashed.
It's whether your hands or
and your utensils
have been washed and unwashed. That's the subject matter. But in that context, he references food. And when he references food in the context of a discussion with Pharisees and with other of the various Jewish groups of that day, he's having a intramural conversation. In other words, within that community, within the group, what would be considered food? And in that group, clearly, food that would be mentioned there would be food that is in keeping with the guidelines, the kosher guidelines regarding what you eat. So, for him to have even said the way in which sometimes Mark is translated, so he declared all foods clean.
So you can eat anything you want.
Yeah, it's nowhere else.
Oh, no, and that's not true.
Yeah, exactly. So he would say, then what you're saying is, so he declared all clean foods clean. Huh? Because again, remember when he's speaking about food, he's talking about that which is kosher food in that context very clearly, because it's a Jewish context. So obviously, that translation misses an important cultural context or historical context. So anyhow, kosher food. Now let's move on to the Acts passage, Acts chapter 11, Acts chapter 12. It's a scene where Peter, Shimon HaShtiyah, is on the roof of a building he's staying in, and he's praying. Good thing to be doing. And while he's praying, the sheet comes down from heaven. And there's all kinds of creatures in there. And the voice says, "Get up, Peter. It's time for a meal." And Peter's response is, "I have never eaten anything unclean." Now, two contexts. Context number one, the animals. In that society, the larger society outside the Jewish world, within the Roman Empire, ate stuff that was certainly on the unclean list. Now, please remember that in Acts chapter 11 and Acts chapter 12, we are now dealing with some 9 or 10 chapters after the invigoration of the believers of Yeshua with the Spirit of God. So we are now, by what some people describe it, in a new age. So in this new age, obviously, these food guidelines should be set aside.
Snake casserole.
Snake casserole.
Yum, yum, yum. It's good for everyone.
Mashed crocodile. Anyhow.
It's delicious.
So that far along into the development of this community, this now Messianic community, Shimon can still say, "I have never eaten anything that's unclean." That's important to understand right away. That was his practice. The way in which, and again, this ascending and descending of the sheet of animals, if I remember right, recurs some 3 times. along with the voice. What is Peter's response? Does he go out and decide, now it's time for snake casserole? No.
Go to Red Lobster.
Go to Red Lobster, exactly, and enjoy surf and turf. That's not his response, either in Acts 11 or in Acts 12, when he is rehearsing to the larger body of the Messianic Jewish leadership in Jerusalem what he had experienced. And in fact, in Acts chapter 10, verses 19 and 20, let's say 11 and 12, I'm sorry, it was 10 and 11. Duh. Okay. All right. And while Peter was pondering the vision, he was delivering what he had seen, the Spirit of God said to him, and then he says, it says, behold. In other words, pay careful attention. Now you can eat everything that moves on the earth. No, that's not what my text says. It says
Still not. No.
3 people are looking for you. Go down and accompany them without hesitation, for I have sent them to you. And then when he arrives on the scene, this was where Cornelius, the Roman centurion, had sent some people to go find Shimon, bring him to his household. And Cornelius already had been visited in a vision by God. It sets all that up. He said, God has shown me that I should not call any person common or unclean. Not any animal, but any person common or unclean. That is, first of all, the Spirit of God's interpretation of the vision was to go with these people. Shimon's understanding of the vision is, don't call any person common or unclean. And then in verses 34 and 35, it's in the other page, he opens his mouth and says, truly I perceive that God shows no partiality, but in every nation, anyone who fears him. Quick footnote here. This is a phrase that describes the technical term God-fearer, and Cornelius was described as a God-fearer. Quick aside, context. The God-fearer, and for this you need to read Patrice's chapter on modern-day God-fearers in the Enduring Paradox. The modern-day God-fearers is a chapter and the Enduring Paradox is the book. She deals with this in much greater detail and very effectively. The lifestyle of these God-fearers. The lifestyle of these God-fearers was these were Gentiles who had adopted Jewish practices. Now, in a God-fearing home, then, would Cornelius have even served Peter, because a meal's involved here? Would Cornelius have ever served Peter anything but what was kosher? Absolutely not, because he was a God-fearer. Fair enough? So, just for that aside, anyone who fears him and does what is right is acceptable to him. Okay? The revelation from the Spirit of God, Shimon's interpretation based on that revelation from the Spirit of God. And then when he rehearses this scene in Acts chapter 11, he says much the same thing, if not exactly the same thing. Peter began and explained to them this story, and he goes on he just outlines the story. And then in verses 8 and 9, I said, no, Lord, for nothing common or unclean has ever entered my mouth there again. But the voice answered a second time, what God has cleansed, you must not call common. And what has God cleansed in that context? He has clearly stated not to call people common or unclean. Okay, so that is the context of this text the Spirit of God's indication as to what this vision meant, and then Shimon, point 3, Shimon's understanding or interpretation of what he'd experienced. And if anyone has the correct interpretation of what these texts mean, it would be him, Shimon. And yet I've heard people take these texts, and this includes someone who served as one of our mentors, and say this was a text that indicates that you no longer have to follow the kosher guidelines. It has absolutely nothing to do. Well, no, it only tangentially does it have to do with the kosher guidelines, as Shimon reminded the Lord that he had never eaten anything non-kosher. And so despite that, I've heard people say, yes, this is what lets us know that we can eat anything we want. And I have gotten that from my very own family.
Oh,
So-
well, yeah, that's for sure. I was going to say, do not tell me who the person was that was. Don't tell me.
Okay.
I will think less of them, and I don't remember who that was, and I don't want to.
And I don't even know if you know who that was, and I will leave it that way.
Yeah, I don't want to know.
Because it is a person that we highly respect.
Yeah.
For just about everything else. But on this one, he got
Bing, bing, bing,
it
bing, wrong.
And he was not an uneducated man. He had theological degrees. He had a doctorate. I don't mean he was a medical doctor. Yeah. So anyhow, there we go.
I'm not sure if that's exactly where this question was going, but I think.
No, it wasn't.
No, but I'm really
I wanted
glad
to
you
bring
went into that.
I wanted to bring that.
Any questions from out in the audience that apply to this particular?
I want to add
line
one
of
more
thinking.
thing.
Sure.
Because as I have read this email, and thank you for the people who sent the email. The title on the email is the 613 Laws of Moses. And that reminds me to reinforce something that's sort of tangential to this discussion, but it's important. According to Jewish tradition, and somebody actually counted these, there are 613 instructions from God as delivered to us in the Tanakh. And sometimes they're called the 613 commandments or laws of. Please let me remind you again. First of all, this is stuff that's Torah, so it's instruction, not law. It is the stuff that God delivered to us directly through the hand of Moses, the Zohar Torah in our services. And our response is, as was our response back then, all that the Lord has said, this we will do. So the commitment then for someone who follows one of these is to follow all of them. And in fact, James says as much. Don't focus or specialize in following just one because if you're going to do that, you need to remember that's just one you've got to follow the whole package. Okay, now, there was another thing I was going to say. Oh, yes. I can't think of the exact reference. Okay, it's a classic Talmudic reference. So the ancient rabbis taught us this. God gave us 613 guidelines through Moses. And then it says he condensed them to 15. And then he quotes a text of scripture. He condensed them to 11, quotes another text of scripture. Condensed them to 6, quotes another text of scripture. Condensed them to 3, the classic text from Mike. Seek justice, walk humbly before God, and forget the third. And then the Talmud goes on. The rabbis are all saying, it's all of them into one, back to 2:4. The just shall live by faith. So if you want to summarize what underlies all of it, as the rabbis did, it is faithfulness to God and a response of faith to God that is critical and the core of all this. And the final thing I want to say is, in Jewish teaching, every one of the 613 can be set aside for the preservation of life, except for 3.
Okay, wait, you often go through that particular thing, and I think it's really important for everybody to understand. So in other words, all the laws may be broken without your going to hell. I'm just putting it down. All the laws except 3.
In order to preserve life.
In order to save your life.
Or somebody else's.
So if somebody says, you have to do this, I'm going to kill you. If it's not one of the 3, go ahead. It gives you the freedom under certain circumstances, which, as much as we like to think they went away in the Middle Ages, these circumstances pop up in different cultures at different times for any group of people. So I'm going to betray my faith if I fill in the blank. There's only three things that are those things. Anything else, if it's to save your life, please go ahead. All right, now he's going to tell us the three things.
What are the three? The first one will not surprise you at all. That is murder. You can't kill someone. You can't destroy a life in order to save a life.
You can't kill someone so that you can live. That would be bad.
Yeah, so murder is one of them. Second one is worshiping another god or idolatry. And the third one, properly understood contextually, is practices that are related to idol worship. In other words, if I might put it this way, the two greatest commandments are what? The rabbis have always said. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your life, with all your strength. That means you have no other gods. So that has to do with two of the instructions. And you're to love your neighbor as yourself. In other words, you don't take a person's life. So in a sense, in another way, once again, the rabbis have told us what are the most important. Well, we got around a whole lot of different circles, remember?
And I think it's because, modern people are just like, I guess, people down through the ages, in the sense that we throw around a lot of terms. And we use a term, and when we're speaking in conversation with somebody we might not know all that well, somebody we work with or somebody we met recently, we don't know them all that well. And we use terms, and we assume that the other person means exactly the same thing by the term they mean that I would mean. And we can't always be sure. And therefore, also, old wives' tales, in other words, things everybody knows that are true except upon further examination, are not true at all and are made up as a story, but people believe them firmly, and that's a whole other thing we could go off on, especially about Jewish people. If people come from outside a Jewish worldview and then they get to know the Jewish worldview, or they meet people who live in a Jewish worldview, and the outsiders are going, what the heck's going on there? That's weird. And so it has to do with what we're familiar with and what we identify with as Jewish. For some of us, that's a ton of things, and for other people, it's like I got two things. They don't eat bacon, and I forget what the other one is. There's another Jewish thing that people do. But other than that, if you ask the next 100 people to walk in your local Target, what do people do that let you know that they're Jewish? Boy, are you going to get a range of weird answers, and half of them are going to go, I'm not sure. They don't eat pig. That's it. That's what I got. So yeah, it is interesting in that way. Plus, and I did want to, and this is going to be my segue.
Okay.
A long time ago, when John and I first started to, as part of our ministry, back when we were, practically teenagers for myself,
Mm-hmm.
we would go in churches, Protestant churches mainly, and do a Passover demonstration meal where we would explain the different things of the Passover meal. It was in a very, very early form back in those days, because over the years we've accrued many things. We've learned a lot of stuff and experienced it raising a family, and the whole thing, makes you wiser about Passover do's and don'ts. But here's what we always noticed, and it became a joke for us. So there's the part of the Passover after the meal when in traditional, modern society, we would have dessert. It's funny, I don't know any cultures that have dessert before the meal.
No, that's not true.
No, okay. But I'm just saying, there might be some we might have to join you if that's the way you roll. If you'd like to have chocolate first before the rest of it, then you might have to find those cultures. But in your average, more like small town Protestant churches, you make the statement, there's no dessert after the Passover meal. People almost got hostile. People almost started to lose their faith. What do you mean we're not having dessert? I think this is American.
Yes.
How dare you tell me what I can and can't eat? How dare you tell me what I can and can't eat? The minute you say to somebody, you can't eat that, they, in our culture, get mad. They do not accept it as anything having to do with them because, by golly, I think they're going to die for the right to eat things that they want to eat. Now, let's not be a good comment about our day and age in general. But I find that to be true too. If you tell some people they can't have a list of things, they don't respond well. The only time when it's taken better is if a medical doctor, you have a chronic problem that has developed, and it's like you have a super allergy. You developed a super allergy for a food you love, and he says, or she says, don't eat that. Then you might take it better. And people within a family, if one of the people in the family is incredibly sensitive to something, the rest of the people in the family are not going to yell at that person going, it's your fault that I can't have a bagel. So I think we need to look at our own behaviors before we start thinking other people are unreasonable. And to answer your questions and then throw it to you again, have John and I eaten pork and bacon and spare ribs and all those things, and aren't they delicious? Yes, both John and I grew up eating those things. We did? Well, then how could you possibly give them up? Actually, we didn't make a big thing out of it, and it was okay. Because, turkey bacon. And you'll find as people get older anyway, this was true for my parents, they just changed from the pork products to something that tasted almost as good and were good enough for their purposes and didn't have the negative connotations in their body. So there's that. But so by the time we had our children, we didn't eat these things. It wasn't a big. I didn't have a lot of problem giving up oysters and clams and other seafoods. I'd had them; they were all right. I'm not going to be cooking them in my house, and so that also wasn't a problem. So, did we have to give it up? Yeah, it wasn't like a big thing. It was like we're just not going to include that anymore. Especially his family, do they think we're weird? Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, they do. But on most occasions, they go along with us. Seeing as how, and I'll give another example, and then I am done. So his brother refuses to eat any chicken or any fowl of any kind. He won't. It's not like, you're a reasonable human being, please be patient while other people enjoy their chicken. No, they had to make him something else because that's what they had to do. And so when his sister wanted to have chicken at her wedding, banquet thing, and they said, but Bobby won't eat it. She says, I'll get him a bowl of Captain Crunch and present it to him because the rest of us will be having a lovely chicken dinner. And I thought, that's the best compromise I've ever heard. And I just sometimes want to give him a bowl of Captain Crunch. Right?
Right.
Which, as far as I know, is kosher.
Yeah.
All right. So, segue. Now, do you want to go into this or do you want to hold off on it? Can you shorten this? You can't. We're talking about, so one of you, and you know who you are, what's your opinion of, here's a word you may not have heard before, the Didache. Did I say a bad word? And it's spelled Didiche. And so it looks like
Bidache. It's misspelled.
Oh. I'm sorry, person who wrote this. I wasn't looking at your spelling. I was trying to give it a pass so we can get to the big part. But the Didache, which is a thing, which I would say, frankly, until I'd say a year ago, I have no idea what that is. And I've spent many, many years of my life studying things that are supposed to be important in both Christianity and Judaism, and I had never heard of it until like a year ago. So take my experience for what it's worth. Do you want to? Yeah, you can't go into all these details that you researched.
Well,
You can, but you can not. You can talk. What? Why are you giving me the no?
I will explain.
Right.
Okay. I'm a little concerned about going into this question because there are two related areas that are important in the discussion, and I think they need to be kept together.
Okay. And
So it'll take. We can make this a concluding statement if you want.
okay.
I mean, a concluding question if you want.
I don't know. It's going to be up to you because we have these two other questions.
Oh, okay.
Well, that's not really a question. That's more of a discussion topic.
All right. Well, since you introduced it,
okay.
let me go ahead.
Since they're all sitting on the edge of their seats, wanting to know what the Didache is. I don't think that's a very good pronunciation that I'm using, but now I'm just
Didache is the way it's often pronounced. Okay, there are two parts to this question. We deal with the second part first because it's far shorter in the response. Well, never mind. We'll just save that part for later. On the daily TV.
Not even. No.
Although they are technically related in larger context, we'll save that one for later.
Good.
Okay, what's your opinion of the Didache? There are others in the Messianic movement who have stated that it's critical in understanding Jewish and Gentile relations. Okay, here we go. What is it? It is let's call it, for lack of a better way to describe it, a manual. And as you look at it more carefully,
It's a written document.
As you look at it more carefully in its context, it was a manual apparently for those people to prepare them, for people back then to prepare for baptism or for church membership. And by back then, I'm talking about the likelihood of its writing is either early 2nd century of the Common Era or late 1st century of the Common Era. That would make it, I'll approach it from a different aspect. It is an anonymous writing. We do not know who wrote it, but because of the time of its writing, it is part of the literature we call the literature of the early church fathers, and that's what it's called when you study this stuff. The exact title or the full title of Didache is "The Teachings of the Lord to the Gentiles by the 12 Apostles." Okay. It's as I said, it's an anonymous work, possibly more likely from Syria, possibly from Egypt. And again, it comes across when you read it as a manual preparing people for church membership and or for baptism. And I'll say this again, it is anonymous, which means it was not written by the 12 apostles, although it's supposed to be the teachings of the 12 apostles. And the very date of its writing is indicative of that. Speaking of dates, we do not have any copy of this. We do not have any copy of this until about the middle of the 11th century, so sometime in the 1050s, the Common Era. That's the earliest copy we have, and it is in Greek. All right? Now, let me see, what else do I want to say about it? Oh, it's a manual that is, it appears to be based on Jewish sources that were then developed into this church manual. So Jewish sources that were used by Christians and then developed by Christians to have this manual of teaching and of practice.
Can I?
Yes, go ahead.
All right. So just to unpack what we have so far. So would you be able to say that by the year 95, that there would have been something that would be for Gentile groups?
Well, yes. But again, remember what, and this is reinforced, the title is the teaching, the full title is the teaching of the Lord to the Gentiles. So it was expressly aimed for how Gentiles should live within these early communities. And these early communities, I'm calling them churches because there's no real indication that these were necessarily what we would call Messianic congregations. They may have been them, they may have been like them, but the emphasis is on Gentiles.
So Rav Shaul would have been out on his missionary journeys. Give us approximate dates for when Rav Shaul was literally going to
50s and 60s.
The 50s and 60s. So within 30 years, there would have been groups that really didn't have any Jewish connection whatsoever, but they believed in the Jewish Messiah.
I wouldn't say any Jewish connection, but not the
Tangential.
Tangential. That would be.
They knew a Jew once.
No. Closer
than that.
Yeah, the main core wouldn't necessarily be Jewish, but there was still some sort of Jewish connection and appreciation.
Synagogue connection with Gentile believers in the Jew.
No. If you're understanding me that way, then I'm not being.
No. I'm saying.
Okay.
What time period would you start having the tangential Gentile congregations, mainly Gentile congregations?
They could very well have started near the end of Rav Shaul's missionary journey, certainly thereafter, because as this message was spreading throughout the Roman Empire, you would be coming into contact with fewer and fewer Jews, and these congregations that would develop them may be largely Gentile, may have had some Jews in them, may have had larger numbers or lesser number of Jews, fewer number of Jews in them. We're not quite sure of the exact nature of those, and I want to deal with that part of it separately. That's why I thought there's a second part. So the main focus is it's aimed at Gentiles. There's an understanding of Jewish connections. How strong the Jewish connections are in that context, we're not sure. Again, part of the literature known as the writings of the early church fathers. I put a date on that. Starts with Clement of Rome in the mid-90s, and then the early part of the second century, in the early 100s. Then Ignatius and Polycarp were just a couple of the names that were also associated with that time period. None of those three gentlemen that I mentioned wrote this. It's anonymous, but it's from that time period. And it is probably from Syria, maybe from Egypt. Okay? So all that by way of background, and it is clearly a manual of teaching and practice. We would call it a catechism. I knew there was another term that might be helpful. If that term means anything to you, if that's helpful, then that's part of it. To quote an author from a century ago, a very prominent historian, a Christian, a committed Christian, and I thought he wrote it very well. He calls it the Christianization of a common Jewish form of moral instruction. The Christianization of a common Jewish form of moral instruction. In other words, they were building on these models of forms of moral instruction within the Jewish community that were used as teaching material. Unconnected with this, so this has nothing to do with the Dead Sea Scrolls, but among the Dead Sea Scrolls, there was something called the Manual of Discipline, 1QS if you follow the academic literature. It's a very early document, probably mid-second century before the Common Era, which is a manual for how to live within the community of Qumran. So these were manuals how to live within these emerging congregations of followers of Yeshua. And again, clearly based on something that's Jewish. We just don't know what the Jewish population of these congregations were. Is that clear enough?
Yeah, I mean, as clear as we can be at this point with an anonymous document written to
exactly.
people.
Exactly. All right. Now, in more recent times, there are groups that have developed, and I'm not speaking negative here, I'm speaking descriptively, a fascination for the Didache, both outside and within Messianic circles. And possibly the fascination has to deal with the fact that they too were trying to deal with Gentile, how do the Gentiles fit in? Possibly it has to do with the fact that this is one of the very oldest documents we have outside the New Testament. And let me remind you, these are then documents that are outside the New Testament. They were never considered part of the New Testament, although some people thought that they ought to be. But the final judgment was quite clearly, and we have some early church fathers who indicate this. This is not part of what we would call Bible. We're not going to for a more generic way of describing. So, informative documents, but not inspired documents. And anything informative that early is interesting. But there are some, I think, who've gone beyond that fascination, as I have observed it, to elevate these documents in importance. None of these groups that I'm aware of, and again, I'm just speaking descriptively, not negatively, none of these groups that I'm aware of in any way consider these documents as inspired. But they have nevertheless raised them to a level of, oh, this has to be, if not the model, a model for life in and around Messianic congregations. Fair enough. That's why that's why we've been discussing this now, because some of you may appear totally tangential. So it's important to understand this because you may bump into people, and obviously the person who sent us the question has bumped into people for whom this is important.
This is not widespread in the Messianic movement.
No.
It's not widespread for people in the Messianic movement. If you were to go to your average Messianic convention and go walk up to random people and say, do you know about the Didache? They'd go, the what?
Yeah, exactly.
Like I did a year ago. The what? And it was right after I said the what that certain people who were related to John decided they didn't have anything else to talk to me. They were going to wait till John comes to talk to him. So that gives you a little inkling of I just was not relevant to them at all, and they're related to me. So, go ahead here.
Okay, so that's what's Didache specific and why it's even important to have this discussion now, because it does occur, or has begun to occur in some Messianic circles. And I think I'll leave that part of it for that, so it's not to be too expansive on this. A related topic that's very important is, so what were the nature of the early congregations of followers of Yeshua? Did suddenly after the 1st or the 2nd century Messianic congregations or Messianic synagogues disappear? And that's what I want to address now briefly in concluding our discussion on this particular question. And the answer is no, they didn't disappear.
Which didn't disappear?
Messianic Jewish synagogues, or the Messianic Jewish connection to the larger Jewish community. It is often assumed after the first revolt against Rome, in the years 66 to 70, even when it started in fault at 73, that, and some people say that when Jerusalem was being destroyed, then many of the believers fled across to what is now Jordan. It was not Jordan then, to Petra.
To the Edomite kingdom.
To the Edomite kingdom, thank you. And that then supposedly began the rift between Jewish followers of Yeshua and the larger Jewish community. The answer to that is no, it didn't. Nor did it occur after the second revolt against Rome in years 132 to 135 on the General Bar Kokhba. We can say that because, first of all, at the end of the 1st century in Jerusalem, this is after the destruction, we have, and by we, I want to amplify that just a bit. If you've gone to Israel with us, when we have toured some of the historic sites, we go to a place called the Tomb of David. It's not the tomb of David. It's
Not of King David, it is.
No. No, although it's often
They keep saying it is,
They
but
keep
it
saying it.
isn't.
they have found the body of someone there. It happens to be a 11th century Crusader soldier.
And his name may have been David, but he was not King David.
So, in the place called David's Tomb, and on site we explain this in more detail, and in other circles we have as well. It turns out that this, as a number of scholars have pointed out, these are the remnants of a first century Messianic synagogue dating to the end of the first century, post destruction of Jerusalem. So we have evidence of a Messianic synagogue. All right, then I'm going to move on now to Capernaum and point this out when we do our study tours of Israel. At Capernaum, you have the remains of a 4th century synagogue on top of a 1st century synagogue, and you know what it is because of the stones that are used there. And on one side, Patrice talks about the nature of these stones. Some basalt and limestone.
Oh, basalt and limestone.
Yeah.
So on top of a basalt building, a black stone building, which is typical of Galilee, you have a white stone building on top of the black stone. They left the black stones there. The black stones, the basalt would have been there when Yeshua went in the synagogue. And then later it was made into a beautiful white building with white stones, but they left that layer of black stones and they built the white stone on top of the black stone. And you could see the 2 floors. So the building that we go into, it's only half there. And that's the one where sometimes we have a chance to do a few prayers. And because Capernaum is very rich in Yeshua imagery, but it also functioned for Jewish people very, very well. And it's there, it was like Yeshua's second home. And there's a lot of things about Yeshua there. And we spend time. But Capernaum is that sort of a perfect place to show how things developed after Yeshua.
All right, so in Capernaum, according to the directors of what was one of the, if not the major excavation of Capernaum, we have an indication that the Messianic Jewish community of Capernaum underwrote the rebuilding of that synagogue in Capernaum, the 4th century synagogue. They were that much a part of the Jewish community, even as late as the 4th century. They were part of and involved in the rebuilding. As it turns out, that synagogue is about half a block from the remnants of Shimon or Peter's home in Capernaum. And by the way, in that home then would be where, after they were done the traditional synagogue service of the day for Shabbat, the Messianic Jews would then go to Shimon's home, which is a very nice home, by the way, and then they would have perhaps what is often called the Lord's Supper, or they would do Havdalah and have some teachings or whatever. There's reference in the book of Acts. That's a geographical context. But the important thing is, in the 4th century, the Messianic Jewish community was still helping to build the Jewish synagogue in Capernaum. And in fact, the leaders of those archaeological excavations have told us that there is evidence of ongoing connection of the Messianic Jewish community, integration of the Messianic Jewish community into the larger Jewish community until the 7th century. All right?
So that's the Dark Ages in terms of Europe.
Okay, now, let me build that out by a mention of 2 other things. In Epiphanius, again, one of the, not the early church fathers, but a fairly early.
Pretty early.
Because he's writing in the 4th century. Epiphanius writes in the 4th century concerning the Messianic Jews, and I quote, "They are approved of by the Jews." Period. And then he lists some of the practices, and they're the traditional Jewish practices. Observing Shabbat, the holidays, the food guidelines. And it said, and in effect he says, before he says that statement I just put in. They are like the Jews in every way, but they believe in Yeshua, the Messiah, so that they are approved of by the Jews. Oh, and then it talks about how they read from the Torah and from the prophets. In other words, you have the Parsha reading and the Haftorah reading. So even in their communities, they follow exactly what we do or what synagogues do. Right? So that's the testimony, the clear testimony going into actually this text is probably right around the year 400. So then early on in the next century, you have this dude by the name of Augustine, or Augustine, depending on how you pronounce it. And when we see him, we'll ask him, so how did you pronounce it?
We have to talk to him, really? Please tell me I don't have to.
Anyhow, Augustine writes a letter to Jerome, another early church leader, and he says, concerning the same group of Jews, Messianic Jews, I quote, they are to be found in all the synagogues of the East. So, 3rd century, into the 4th century, there's clear evidence. In the end of the 4th century, you've got the statement by Epiphanius. In the beginning of the 5th century, you've got the statement. These people are still involved with the Jewish community as Messianic Jews. And then you've got the evidence of the claim. So all that to say that, bringing it now back full circle, Didache, how do we integrate Gentiles? Or how do these early communities, however Jewish or non-Jewish they were in population, integrate Gentiles? But side by side, and even more importantly, you've got to remember there was this whole line now that indicates that as Jews, as Messianic Jews, we remain part of the Jewish community as accepted by the larger Jewish community all the way into the 7th century. What happened? Oh, before I get to what happened in the 7th century. Yes. Forgot about this, but it just occurred to me. At the synagogue in Tiberias, 4th century synagogue in Tiberias, there was found in the library of the synagogue a Hebrew version of the Gospel of Matthew and a Hebrew version of the Gospel of John in the synagogue library in Tiberias, which was the place, the final place where the Sanhedrin sat as they were finalizing the Talmud. So, important location, another important indication of the integration of the communities. Okay. Unless there are questions on this from out there. And there's another part to that question, to that email, which
has to do with Franz Delitzsch, and we're not going to talk about Franz tonight, but we do have answers about that.
Okay, so any questions, follow-up questions on that, or we always want to leave it open for any questions, as they say,
from the audience.
From the
yes.
audience.
Any follow-up questions, or are you all bored out of your mind by the Didache? But as I said, if you hear it, here's some games people play. I'm just going to mention this as games, and well, you're getting your hubbed already.
Yes. Our
5.5 minute conclusion of the Sabbath. And it really is dark out, so it's appropriate to do it now. It's really dark out. Here's what games people play. And in my experience, it has mainly been the male gender who enjoys these games, but I'm sure there are some women who also enjoy that, which is, I like to think I'm a person of great influence, and I'm a student, and I just love to know what smart people think. So that's my goal in life, is to know what are smart people in the Messianic movement thinking. I want to get in on their thought process, and I might even read some articles, or I might listen to some guy who's talking blah, blah, blah about stuff that I'm not familiar with. But then what happens is those kinds of people all get together in a group, and they play a game of, can you top this? And in the game of, which is different from Stump the Rabbis, it's, can you top this? So if a person comes and talks, or you read an article on Didache, and then another person comes up to you and you start discussing this thing, which everybody else in the group is saying, I need to go get a cup of coffee, and I have to check on whether my kids are okay, but there are 3 people left, and then it becomes a thing. And then it becomes a social thing where if you haven't talked and discussed about the Didache, you're just not cool like the rest of these guys over here who are the smart moving people. Whereas the sheep, the rest of us, we're meandering around going ba ba ba. We're so not cool, and we did not so get into the discussion about the Didache. So, having said that, if you don't know anything about it and now you are sure you don't want to know anything about it because it doesn't really affect how you live your life, I say more power to you, that it is more impressive to have people who are dedicated to Yeshua and to want to actually follow him and to learn about him, even in the history and in how we as believers develop the styles of things that we do now, which has been a process. But it is nice that some people are trying to figure out how all these things fit in, but those things come and go. Was that fair enough?
That's fair enough.
He didn't hear our word I said, but he's going to agree with me because he's a...
No, I didn't. No. Can you top this?
Yeah, so don't fall into the trap of, can you top this? And definitely do not talk to a relative of yours like she's of no importance because she doesn't know about the Didache. That's hurtful. Anyway, let's talk about ending Shabbat so these people can go do what they're going to do. There's dead air. What are we doing?
I was finding the place.
We both come out of radio TV, so dead air to be avoided at all costs.
Okay. As we are ready to conclude Shabbat and celebrate the fact that we've had the time to observe Shabbat and celebrate it, as well as anticipate the time we are ready to celebrate it again. Although now I've mentioned it, let me remind you that the next Shabbat we celebrate is also going to happen. Yeah, also happens to be Rosh Hashanah. So we'll see you all next Friday.
Next year.
Which will be next year.
Well, on Saturday.
Well, Friday night, yeah.
You wanted to get through this year fast, didn't you? Doesn't everyone agree? We just want to get through this year and go to next year. Well, you'll be able to experience a little bit of that next week.
So anyhow, see you all Friday night as we begin the celebration of the new year, Rosh Hashanah. And it will be at 7 o'clock on these.
It's actually
same bat time, same bat channel.
Same bat time, same bat channel. Speaking from the 60s, like we all do all the time.
Okay. All right, we begin.
All right, and now we have the brand new matches with the green light, so it's environmental, and we have a brand new candle, so we're getting ready for the new. And even though the wicks are not spread out, they're all braided together because we got this candle in Israel. And so it's officially a Havdalah candle, even though it looks sort of plain.
Okay.
Behold, God is my salvation. I will trust and will not be afraid. For the Lord my God is my strength and my song. He also has become my salvation. For the Lord my God is my strength and my song. He also has become my salvation. La 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 la. La 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 la.
Behold, God is my salvation. I will trust and will not be afraid. For God, the Lord, is my strength and song, and he has become my salvation, my Yeshua. Therefore, with joy, we will draw water out of the wells of salvation. Salvation belongs to the Lord. Your blessing be upon your people. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our refuge. In the past, the Jews had light and joy and gladness and honor, and I remind you, as I always do, the text that comes from the end of the book of Esther. And so it relates to God's preserving us even during the time of what we now celebrate as Purim. So we say, so be it with us. I will lift up the cup of salvation and call upon the name of the Lord. And the cup reminds us to be joyful because the cup is a symbol of joy in the biblical text. So, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, borei peri hagafen. Amen. Deserving of praise are you, O Lord our God. You are the ruler of the universe. You bring us forth the fruit of the vine. We won't drink yet. We now take the spice box.
Yes, and I renewed the spices in it last week.
Yes.
So shake it gently.
And line, 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 Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, borei minei besamim, borei minei besamim. Line, 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 line. Before we can, instructions. We have smelled, we've savored the sweetness of Shabbat and anticipate that to come. And as we say the blessing for the light, we look at the light between the cracks in our fingers to better differentiate between light and darkness. So we watch in your fingernails. Okay. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, borei me'orei ha'esh, borei me'orei ha'esh. Amen. Line, 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 line. Deserving of praise are you, O Lord our God, ruler of the universe, who creates the light of the fire. The previous one was deserving of praise are you, O Lord our God. You are the ruler of the universe, who creates various kinds of spices. And now we continue. Deserving of praise are you. You are the Lord our God, the ruler of the universe, who's made a distinction between holy and ordinary, between light and darkness, between Israel and the nations, and between the seventh day and the 6 other days of the week. Baruch atah Adonai hamavdil bein kodesh lecho. Deserving of praise are you, O Lord, who distinguishes between holy and ordinary. And now we drink the wine, and then once we have done that, we leave a few remnants in the glass to pour into the bowl so we can extinguish the candle.
Ready? Now it's time. Okay, you want me to do the whole thing? Or just, I can.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Ready?
Bye-bye, Shabbat.
Bye-bye, Shabbat.
And so we anticipate not just the coming Shabbat, but as Eliyahu Hanavi reminds us, the Shabbat that brings in the Messianic age. Eliyahu Hanavi, the prophet, the person from Gilad, may he come quickly, bringing with him Messiah, son of David.
Eliyahu Hanavi, Eliyahu Hatishbi,
Eliyahu Hanavi, Eliyahu Hagiladi.
Eliyahu Hanavi, Eliyahu Hatishbi,
Eliyahu Hanavi, Eliyahu Hagiladi. Bimheira Yavo Aleinu, Bimheira Yavo Aleinu, Im Mashiach ben David. Im Mashiach ben David. La 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 la. La 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 la. La 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 la. And then we say Shavua Tov.
Shavua Tov. Have a great week.
And a great conclusion of the year.
Yes.
And we look forward to seeing you, as we said, for Rosh Hashanah and the beginning of the holiday celebration.
Yes. Same bat time. Yeah, at 7 o'clock.
7 o'clock.
7 o'clock Friday night begins Rosh Hashanah.
Yep.
Apples and honey. If you don't know about it, you can look it up, like in places like in Wikipedia.
Or My Jewish Learning.
Or My Jewish Learning. There are so many Jewish sites where you can find out how to celebrate it at your own house with your own people. And apples and honey will be available this time of year. Thanks. We appreciate your patience. We appreciate your